posthumanism, which is really interested in or aims to decenter the human being as sort of a discrete body at the center of existence, and also at the center of our understanding of its existence in the world. Now, if we look at recent technological development, I think it becomes very difficult for us to maintain this idea that the body is fundamentally separated from the non-body in a way, right? I mean, if you look at bionic implants, you know, the way medicine is moving into technologizing the body, these technologies sort of becoming part of the body, then I think it becomes this sort of post-humanistic and relational ontology becomes, you know, quite attractive as a way to look at our bodies and the relationship of our bodies to the world. Now, you know, I'm not going to go into too much detail on posthumanism. I'm not an expert on posthumanism, but I found it very important to include it because it's something that keeps coming up in the studies that you read. Posthumanism tries to break this sort of separation between the body and what is not the body, sort of question the boundaries that we have established over centuries. And it really places the focus on what they call the relationality of objects, bodies, material and non-material entities in the world. Now, how have these developments sort of influenced literacy, the field of literacy? I think one of the most prominent approaches to have emerged from within this post-humanistic perspective is socio-materialism. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this tradition or have read about it. I'm just going to briefly sort of go over its main tenets. Again, what it does is it takes this sort of relational ontology and tries to map it onto our understanding and our study of literacy. And I think one of the most important notions to take to pay attention to is agency and the role of agency in a socio-materialist view of literacy, because here agency does no longer resides in this sort of discrete literate individual, right? Agency is viewed as sort of distributed across an assemblage of objects, texts, and people. And it's very interesting, if you read this kind of research, there are certain words that keep coming up. You know, assemblage is one of those, right? That we don't talk about there's a separation. We're looking at this kind of loose assemblage, loose coming together of objects, texts, bodies, you know, senses, smells, you know, you name it. And the other one that I didn't put on here, but it's kind of captured in the visual, is entanglements. You know, that's another very, very common sort of, I would say, somewhat theoretical notion of how we need to think about, you know, things within a relational ontology. Now, you may be wondering, what does this look like? You know, when it comes to literacy, what is this? What does it mean to say that agency is relational and distributed? In a recent volume, edited volume on this subject, Lenters and McDermott very helpfully actually give us some examples. I will say that a lot of this research, very interestingly and somewhat tellingly, has been situated or located within preschool settings, you know, and I mean, we can talk about this later or not, but I find it quite telling, you know, that's obviously the little ones, you know, they're way more physical, and they have that kind of freedom to be physical in their environment, school environment. So but I always wonder, you know, okay, what does this mean for the high school? What does this mean for middle school? You know, things that are a little bit where things get a bit more structured. So, you know, some of the examples that the authors give, they really point to the power or agency of particularly pop cultural phenomena, you know, how characters, storylines, memes sort of come up and shape children's or young people's, and by change we can mean foster or impede children's subsequent meaning making activities. If you have children in your environment, or obviously if you're a teacher, you see this readily happening, I think. So how do we do this kind of research? How does socio-materialism, empirical research, you know, how does that look? One interesting concept that has been proposed is the idea of literacy as event, and this is in juxtaposition to Brian Street's famous notion of the literacy event, right? And the literacy event, Street's notion really looked at literacy event as sort of this temporally bounded, structured, and in a way a priorily literacy focused events. So there was always this assumption that where there's text, there's literacy. Now socio-material approaches come and say, no, it's a priori. We need to look at really the ongoing flow of activity, literate or not, okay? And then we need to understand how, through this kind of coming into relation of bodies, texts, all kinds of objects and things, does literacy happen or not? And if it does, how? And within this paradigm, there's been a lot of research on affect. And affect is juxtaposed again to emotion, if you like. So affect is really understood as this sort of embodied or felt engagement, something that's really kind of pretextual, and is often juxtaposed to this thing called emotion, to which we can attach a label and which we kind of consciously can reflect on. And as you can already kind of sense from these descriptions, right, socio-material approaches in general take a view of literacy, or rather position themselves against a view of literacy as this rational, purposeful, and text-centric engagement, right? And they really try to focus on everything that's not that. So again, against this sort of conscious sign maker or agentic sign maker, let's focus more on the felt and the embodied sensations of the body in relation to, again, text objects and other bodies. Now, because socio-materialism sets itself against what they call representational approaches to literacy, and by that, of course, pretty much the entire sort of spectrum of what we understand to be sociocultural approaches to literacy would fall under what we might label representational approaches to literacy. So socio-materialism, at least some of the leading scholars that I have read, consider themselves as a non-representational approach to literacy. Now, that just puzzled me the first time I read it, because it almost sounded like an oxymoron. But, it's this kind of, it goes again with this very different view of ontology that the whole sort of theory rests on. But as a result of being a non-representational approach to literacy, the scholars really have tried to move away from the representational approaches that we have developed within the sociocultural approach to capture literacy, right? So the task is, and it's a really difficult task, is how do you describe this literacy as this felt embodied something, right? Without recourse to our representational tools. And so in some of the research that I have read, scholars use things like creative nonfiction, vignettes, sketches, snapshots. And frankly, this was rather unsatisfactory to me. And I'm very, very interested in socio-materialism, but this is the point where I, as somebody who's very, very committed to sociocultural approach to literacy, even critical approaches, I felt like a little bit let down, I'm with you. Let's capture embodiment. Let's capture the slightly subconscious or the non-agentive, but can we really do that with what to me looks like basically like verbal modes of representation? So that much about socio-materialism. Now, another important area for scholarship, body of work, of course, where embodiment has really come to prominence, I would say, even in the last 10 years, is social semiotic multimodal literacy research. And I don't have too much time to go into this, but I want to highlight sort of two lines of work that I find particularly intriguing and kind of really at the forefront. And one is, of course, Victor's work on embodied teaching and sort of subsequent work that's built on this. And in embodied teaching, embodiment, the body, is seen sort of as a 3D semiotic complex. Sorry, Victor, it's just kind of my cheeky shorthand to refer to understand for myself, sort of the basic argument that you're making, right? Where teachers, as embodied beings, right, use they're corporeal resources. So again, within the social semiotic frame, these are seen as resources, and jointly deploy or orchestrate them with other semiotic technologies in the classroom, such as whiteboards, computers, pointers, books, what have you, in order to create or design a particular learning environment within the classroom, or design learning. It's not just the body itself, but also the movement and positioning of the body within the classroom, which is, Victor and some other scholars that he's worked with termed spatial pedagogies, which is part of this important line of research. And I think, even though ontologically I see this as fundamentally different from sociomaterialism, what I find interesting is that both focus on this emergent nature, okay, in meaning making and literacy, right? So the term emergent again keeps coming up. The other line of research within social semiotics, multimodality, is what's come to be known as sensory literacies. And this is the work of Kathy Mills and her colleagues and collaborators. With the last, I think the book came out in 2016, where she first sort of theorized this approach more fully. And really I think this sort of theoretical orientation to literacy has grown out of the observation that new technologically mediated forms of literacy are, they involve the body in fundamental ways. That was not the case before, when all we had was pen and pencil. So just think about VR, right? Virtual reality headsets. And if you've ever been in a room with somebody who's wearing one of those, you have to duck, okay? You really have to kind of watch out, because they're just flaying their arms around. There's this really so much body involved. And Kathy Mills has these fantastic and so interesting, all the data that she has on, these kids engaged in drawings, and it's super, super exciting stuff. But Mills and others' point here is that currently our literacy theories are not equipped they're not adequately equipped to address the question of the body, the question of how do we theorize the body in relation to literacy. And I think that she says that part of the reason for that is what she calls the hegemony of sight. And that is that the vision has, for the longest time, been sort of the central sense that we have associated with literacy, right? And so her argument is, can we expand that and really take a look at how the body and what she calls the whole sensorium is implicated in literacy and literate activities. So to sum up, embodiment has been at the forefront of theory and research within literacy studies, but there are some differences, some line of difference across the different bodies of work. I think what's common to all these approaches is the desire to draw attention and study exactly how the body is implicated in literacy practices, and thus implicitly to sort of overcome the mind-body dualism that has characterized literacy scholarship, just like everything else. But there are substantial differences. I think social semiotic approaches like Victor's and Kathy Mills, the body is, of course, in line with the theories, fundamentally understood as part of sensory motor resources, right? That an agentive sign maker uses or deploys, in the various meaning-making pursuits. Whereas for sociomaterialism, for sociomaterial or non-representational approaches, the body figures basically as a somatic system, right? And the individual perhaps as a sensor. These are my terms. I'm not sure if they would agree with this characterization, but to me, that's a very big difference. Methodologically, the toolkits are large. The toolkits that these approaches are drawing on are sort of very similar to past research, not necessarily similar to each other. Although I think both in socio-material research as well as in definitely embodied multimodal research, we have seen some excellent attempts at new representational forms, of conveying what's going on in this emergent engagement of the body. Victor, you have a wonderful way of charting that. I'm sorry, I should have put up the graph in here in your book, of kind of visually, how can we represent this movement of the teacher? and how it engenders learning. Okay, so this is sort of a theoretical backdrop to the study, which I will be sort of sketching out for the rest of the presentation. And again, I want to emphasize this, what I'm going to present to you. Okay, I'm going to start with the description of the study, and the third part of the presentation will be about sort of the findings, okay? But it's very much thinking in progress, okay? So bear with me. I will show you data and stuff, so don't worry. I'll make it worth your time. Okay, so this is this very basic sort of information about the study. It's a small funded project which aims to investigate secondary age Singapore youth emotive embodied experiences in relation to both school-based as well as outside of school literacy activity and development. And because I only speak English from the languages of Singapore, we do spend, most of our focus is basically on English. But the kids do talk about other languages if it's relevant. Now, the study conceptualizes emotion experience as in two different but complementary ways. First, as a conscious act of emotive sense-making. And in this regard, our primary data is narrative interviews with the students. And we interviewed each student on 5 different occasions using the narrative interview sort of protocol. And each occasion was focused on a different aspect of literacy. I will not be talking about this data today. The second conceptualization considers emotion as an embodied and somatic response to particular stimuli. And this is going to be the focus for today. And for this part, most of the data that we have managed to collect was focused on the at-home literacy activities. I will have to say here that the entire study took place, the all data collection took place during the pandemic. So I will spare you the nightmarish details, but it was extremely, extremely difficult to get data. In fact, we had a much larger ambition for the study. We had all this like elaborate methodology and whatnot. I mean, it was just brutally painful trying to get people, especially schools. We did manage quite a nice bit of data for the home part, but the school was just extremely difficult, for understandable reasons. But okay, so the very general research question that's guiding our study in the second part is, what embodied or bodily reactions characterize young people's engagement in literacy activities. Sorry, that should say out of school. And again, so we're interested in embodied emotive experiences of literacy. Participants for this portion are 11 secondary age children, and here you see basic demographic breakdown. None of this is really consequential for today's talk, but I just wanted to show you. It was 6 boys and 5 girls, basically. Okay, so what we did was we visited the homes of each child on 4 separate occasions, and we recorded 1 hour's worth of literacy activities each time. Now, this could be gaming, this could be whatever. So it was a mix of sort of homework sometimes and reading. We really didn't have any restrictions of what they were supposed to be doing. We didn't even define literacy activity for them, but we just said, well, just do something with what you would do with a computer or books or your school stuff for 1 hour, and we'll record it. And here's the image shows you the basic setup for the study. So we used 3 video cameras, and one was positioned on the students' sort of desk or wherever they were sitting, so that we can capture what exactly they were doing. One was directed at their face, and that was mainly used for the facial expression analysis, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then the third one was on sort of an environmental camera to capture what else, the broader sort of setting. Now, in terms of like the sensor technology or what we could call somatic measures, actually really only the picture on the left, the galvanic skin response, I think should qualify as somatic measure. But anyway, I'm just saying, I'm putting them here because they're sort of non-traditional ways in literacy research to gather data. So in addition to the 3 video feeds, we also collected biometric data in the form of galvanic skin response, and I'll tell you what that is in a second. Okay, And so the sensor that you use, that you're seeing in the pictures, are possible sensors. Those were not the ones we actually used. I'll show that one to you in a minute. But there's multiple ways in which you can capture that galvanic skin response. And then for the second measurement, sort of non-representational, whatever you're going to call it, new methodology, we used automated facial expression analysis. And that's just an image to show you this is not our participant, how that kind of looks when the camera, when the analysis software is aimed at somebody's head, right? It's just reading the face. Okay, let's talk a little bit about GSR. It is a physiological measure of arousal, okay, and arousal being a very general measure of the body's readiness for sensory input. And the way it works is that it measures tiny shifts in the skin's conductivity, and these shifts are triggered by shifts in sweat secretion, which in turn is triggered by some kind of changes in the environmental stimuli. Okay, so something changes in the environment, and these are extremely subtle. So these are not conscious, right? So this does not register. It's not like when you go out, you know, in Singapore and you just start sweating like, you know, crazy because you sweat, your physical sweat. These are imperceptible changes to the human being, but the GSR sensor picks it up. Okay, tiny, tiny changes. Now, importantly, the GSR signal measures the intensity of the response, namely, you know, I'll show you in a minute, the peaks basically, but not its valence. So again, like I need to emphasize here, this is a general measure. And so it doesn't tell you, the GSR signal does not tell you, is this kid like getting excited or is he getting anxious? So that's kind of one thing that that is very important to note. Now, GSR has been used in social science research for decades, but there's been a sharp uptick of studies in education over the last 5 years. And again, GSR, being a measure of arousal, is usually then taken to mean to be a proxy, taken as a proxy for something else. Okay, most often it's taken as a proxy of emotional engagement, you know, whatever that means. But it tells you something about, again, you know, something happens, you know, in the environment, and then your body just registers a small kind of engagement peak, if you like. How is it measured? There are multiple sensors out there on the market. We used the Shimmer 3 GSR Plus sensor. As you can see, it's a very simple and very non-invasive technology. It is usually worn on the non-dominant hand, and there are 2 electrodes attached to the index and the middle finger, and then the signal goes into this white little box, which is then connected to the laptop via Bluetooth, right? So the signal goes via Bluetooth from the little memory box or device to the computer. Okay, a bit of physics. This is important because later on when I show you the charts, you will see these peaks in the data. So this is such a nice sort of visual. The electrical signal that the GSR device receives has basically two components, a phasic component and a tonic component. Now, you know, we don't need to get into the physics of this, but basically the phasic component is what a lot of the GSR researchers use, because that is the component that registers fluctuations. This is not more sensitive to fluctuations, okay, in the electrical current. So probably that wasn't accurate physically speaking, or in terms of physics, but it is the component that can show, that has more time sensitivity and more sensitivity toward the environmental stimulus. So whereas the other one, the tonic conductance component, that's got a longer time span, so it's not as quick to respond if something happens, you know, in the environment. So the little stars that you see are the EDA peaks, which we're going to see in a minute. For automated facial expression analysis, we have used a software which is an add-on to the basic software that we're using for analyzing all this data. And it's based on this actually old facial action coding system from the 1970s, which was developed based on using human coders. The idea is that breaking down, you know, you break down you group particular muscles, facial muscles, into groups that are sort of supposed to be responsible for generating particular types of expressions, which are then linked to particular types of emotions. The software that's actually being used is trained or has been trained on, a lot of faces from a lot of different countries. So they at least claim to be quite representative and not biased toward particular ethnic groups or genders or age or whatnot. And it's been validated in many, many studies, actually. We use iMotions as the main software and platform where all the data that I just talked to you about, so the 3 video streams are sort of plugged in, fed into the software along with the shimmer signals. And of course, the face being captured also goes into iMotions. It's compatible with all these sources of data that I've just described. Remember how I mentioned to you about the significance of peaks, of the facet component? And so, that's one of the key output measures that the software automatically gives you is what they call the peak amplitude, the average peak amplitude, or the average peak per minute. In addition, and sorry if I know I'm kind of rushing through this, and if this is new to you, I apologize in advance. Hopefully it will become a little bit clearer once I show you the data. But I still feel like I should go over this at a minimal, kind of at a minimal depth. And it also shows you visual graphs, when it analyzes the face for emotions, and on the right hand side you see all the emotions that that the software is categorizing the participants' facial expressions into. It gives you a visual graph of that as well. In addition, of course, it's not all automated. We did manual coding of the stream, basically. So 1 hour each session, what were the kids doing? Were they doing homework? Were they using a device? Were they doing reading? Were they doing Chinese homework? Were they doing English homework? Because when you annotate, you can easily sort of correlate some of these, data sources with your coding, as I'll show you in a minute. Okay, so after all this technical detail, I'm sure you'd like to see some results and some data. So in line with the purpose of the talk today, I would like to use the data and some results to illustrate how somatic measures can offer different conceptualization of the body or embodiment within literacy research. So specifically, I will argue that depending on how we use this technology and methodology, we can conceptualize the body as a metric, as a relational entity, and as layered simultaneity. Okay, so here's the first graph I want to show you. As I mentioned, one of the measures that you can get out of this software is peaks per minute, okay? And it gives you basically a proxy for, how engaged, if you like, okay, the kids were. So we did this very basic chart of showing, how is this different when they are engaged in recreational literacy and when they're engaged in homework? So as you can see, this is for Anne across all the 4 sessions. We do see that, based on the average peaks per minute, there's somewhat more engagement when it comes to recreational literacy. So Em was quite an avid reader. She did a lot of reading, but other things as well. And you see the difference is not major, it's not significant in a statistical sense, but it is a tendency, right? Now, especially if you sort of not juxtapose, but look at this at the level of all the 11 participants, you see that the same pattern still holds true. So on average, we could say that when these kids are engaged in recreational literacy, there's slightly more, appears to be, based on the GSR signals, slightly more engagement than when they're engaged in homework. There's more. So it gets interesting when we throw in gender. Okay, so that's kind of the nice thing about this software is that you really can crank out these charts, that sort of visually show you the relationships. Our sample, I will say though, that our study was not set up as an experimental study. So we have a very small sample size. We're not trying to show necessarily, although we do test if possible for statistical significance, but there's given the small sample size, we are very limited in the types of statistical analyses that we are actually able to conduct. But that's actually not so much the point, definitely not for today. So here, if you look at the chart, what we're seeing here is that, when it comes to gender, there seems to be a difference, right? for recreational literacy, boys recorded more peaks per minute than girls, whereas for school-related literacy, it's the inverse. Again, these are trends, right? Not necessarily statistically significant results given the small sample size, but I do think that they tie in nicely with existing research on literacy differences between boys and girls, and I think it would be fascinating to explore this a little bit further, you know, in subsequent, perhaps more experimental research or in research with a larger sample size. Okay, so what do we mean? What do I mean when I say the body as a metric? The main point here is that embodiment, right, is really translated into numerical data. Okay, the body and this metric that I showed you all in all these charts is really an index, sort of a condensed index for certain psychological or psychosomatic states. It is a very decontextualized measure. Okay, it gives us snapshots. It enables comparisons within as well as across individuals, but you know, it's a metric. It doesn't give us a real contextualized view of the body and embodiment as part of ongoing literacy activity. Now, the second sort of proposal I'm making here is that we can also use this data to think about the body as a relational entity. Okay, let me show you, let me explain to you what you're seeing here. The top two are the video feeds, right? Remember I told you that there were 3 feeds. Now, I took away the face because of confidentiality reasons. So you're seeing what Anne is doing, I think, in the first 6 minutes of the video on the left, and then that's her from sort of the environmental camera. Now, the top 3 bars give us visualization of the sensor data. The very top bar is the GSR peaks. Okay, so you see the top dark blue kind of waves going across. So this is, we're going time is left to right, the 1 hour session. So it just shows you sort of the sort of ebb and flow, you know, the peaks kind of moving along, peaks meaning like the ones that kind of go above a particular threshold. The second one is for engagement, and engagement is being measured by the facial expression analysis. Okay, that's one of the emotions you can code for. And similarly, joy is one of the emotions that the facial expression analysis can code for. So I just put those 2 up there. I could put all the rest of them up there, but I would clutter the screen. The bottom half is our coding. So you can see, for example, that in this particular activity, in this particular session, sorry, Anne was mainly doing homework. You see the brown bar going across. So those are sort of intervals of homework. She started with a bit of reading, or that she moved on to homework. Now, to me, what is interesting is that if you see the top line activity with the pink, kind of small pink intervals, you see that at the very top of the horizontal bars, right? So you see how she does homework, and then there's like these intervals where she switches to her phone and starts chatting with her friends. Then she goes back to homework, and then there's again this sort of short brief interval with her chatting. Okay, it's almost like there's a rhythmic pattern to this, right? Where it's homework, chatting, homework, chatting, homework, chatting. So you know, I think that we can see that perhaps even more clearly here. I just zoomed in, okay, into the last 12 minutes of the recording that I showed you on the previous slides, and you see how you see the signals, the engagement, joy, and I did valence there for some reason. It really aligns with these peaks, okay, centering around, of course, her use of phone. Okay, so to me, I mean, I hope this is clear. I'm showing you here how the different modalities of data, if you like, right, really sort of align. Interestingly, the GSR peaks do not necessarily align to this, right? So we don't see a strong sort of set of peaks coming around the time when she's actually chatting on social media. So, you know, but the facial expression analysis very strongly correlates with, at least visually, with the type of activity here. Okay, so when we look at the body as a relational entity, I think it really gives us a very, very powerful methodological tool to feed into what socio-materialism is after, which is sort of this ebb and flow of engagement with our material surrounds. What I find particularly intriguing in Anne's example, and I would love to explore this in a full spectrum of the data, is this kind of relational pull of certain objects, specifically the cell phone. And I think all of us can relate to this, right? It's almost like there's this haptic memory, right? And there's something about that phone that even if you're engaged in like some serious work, and then, you know, every so often you just reach and you sort of have to check your phone. I mean, some of you might be better human beings and you don't have to do that, but and I think the wonderful thing about the sensor technologies is that they can really help us visualize this. They can actually help us document this much better than I think than a researcher's observation. Or it's not better, it's like in addition to, right? Because I'm not claiming that this is like complete data. Okay, the final point I want to make here is the body as layered simultaneity. And here I'm drawing on Jan Blommert's term that he introduced in 2005. And I'll talk about the term in a minute, but let's look at some data. So this is a different kid. This is Samuel, and this is his data from his session during which he gamed the entire time. So again, the top blue peaks are his GSR peaks, you know, pretty steadily going. And then below that, you have the facial expression data or visualization for engagement, you know, how kind of where the peaks of engagement were. And again, the peaks of joy, right? And here's Samuel doing homework. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is the next slide, which if you compare the two, just based on the visual data, it seems that Samuel was pretty engaged when he was doing homework, which seems to go sort of against the original GSR charts that I showed you, right? Remember, I sort of made the argument that, no, the GSR data shows that, you know, engagement was a little bit higher when of course it was averages, right? So it's possible that not each kid would fit into that pattern. But still, look at that. I mean, the homework is visibly, right? There's more engagement, and the peaks, there's definitely way more peaks going on. Okay, well, we can introduce another layer of data here, which is valence. And that's another affordance of the facial expression analysis. Not only does it give you the emotions, it also automatically is able to detect the valence of emotions, again, based on facial expressions and analysis of facial expressions. So there is a difference here, right? If you notice that during the gaming, most of the signal goes up, you see, which is in the positive. You see the horizontal line is the 0. Whereas for homework, if you look at the valence data stream, there are many frequent dips into the negative. So that would kind of be more of a slightly negatively valenced engagement or emotion. Okay, but we can further complicate this and point out that during both activities, actually, Samuel was chatting with his friends the entire time. When he was gaming, he was chatting about game-related stuff, okay? And when he was at homework, a lot of time it was about homework. And the point I'm trying to make here, of course, is that how do you tease this apart? You know, I mean, even if you have all this sensory data, you know, and what's interacting with what? What's causing what? And of course, I will say that this, again, emphasize, again, that this was not set up as an experiment. And I thought that was one of the questions in the you know, that Victor de Sick collects is can we, you know, how can we sort of establish what's important, what's influencing what? Well, maybe in an experiment you can, because it would be very easy to control for some of these influences, but this is a very naturalistic setting, right? And in a naturalistic setting, this is what happens. You know, there's an oral feed, there's the body, there's objects, there's the phone. You know, it's an incredibly complex and layered simultaneity. This is almost my last slide. And I just want to say that, you know, layered simultaneity as a term from Blommert really captures how discourse is, discourse carries or includes meanings that are scalar, okay? So some meanings are from the now, some meanings are historical, and not all of these meanings are consciously accessible or available to people, right? And I think this, we can also think about the body in this way, okay? so that all these different layers of the body's engagement with the world, right, happen at the same time, but they may not each, they may interact with each other and produce very different outcomes for literacy. And also, I would say, very importantly, some of this is really sedimented. If you think about the way all of these kids sit at their desks, right, hunched over, I think that's a very important part of how we think about literacy, right? That body hunched over. That's a very common way for kids to sit at home while they're doing homework, and obviously that's not an emergent property. I mean, it can change, don't get me wrong, but this is more sedimented. This is what Bourdieu calls hexis, right? The hexis of homework, right? Is how our bodies are sort of, they have learned, they've been socialized to sit that way. So I think that can also be a potential source of tensions between these learned embodiments of literacy and some of the push and pulls that are coming along as you actively engage in literacy. Okay, I'm sorry. I hope it wasn't too conceptual and theoretical for a Thursday afternoon. Implications is that I have asked and showed many more questions, I think, and possibilities than answered questions. But I mean, that's just where I am, honestly, in the process. I do think that after having done this sort of preliminary look at the data, I think it's very important that we actually try to theorize the body in multiple ways that can be complementary and help us understand really, truly, what is, how do we figure the body into literacy? I think the ultimate question that I would love to pursue, I would love for us to pursue is how the very nature, the text, the outcome or whatever of literacy is fundamentally shaped by our embodied experiences of it, but that's sort of for the future. Okay, thank you so much.